Well, it's great to see all of you here. And I want to start off by saying a couple of words about the center I direct. I'm the director of the Center for Unconventional Security Affairs here at the University of California, Irvine. And it's a sort of unique entity. We were set up 8 years ago to study those types of security threats which all of us are vulnerable to. We're talking about infectious disease, environmental change, cybercrime, these types of things which have changed the lives of everyone in this room and everyone around the world. Our focus has been, and we have become quite well known for our work about the particular challenges faced by the least advantaged, the most vulnerable communities in the world. And we do a tremendous amount of field research in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. But we also do a fair amount of work here in Southern California and try to because these issues are as relevant to us as they are to people anywhere else. It's a sort of unique structure. We focus on doing field-based research, so we send a lot of people out into the field and have very extensive partnerships with a variety of NGOs and universities around the world. We focus on integrating students and developing leadership skills for the next generation of Americans, and at any one time we have between 35 and 100 students actively doing research in the center. I think today, as this quarter starts, we have about 35 working on issues. And we focus very, very much on making sure that the research we do is available to decision makers and policy makers around the world. We do a lot of briefings in both Ottawa and in Washington, and we have a special relationship with the UN and have been the lead author of a number of high-level UN documents. In fact, we've led assessment missions in Sierra Leone and participated in peace-building missions in Congo and Rwanda. So we do research, we involve students, and we try and make it relevant to the world. We've had a very long and very productive partnership with the Government of Canada, with the Consul General in Los Angeles over the years. And in fact, even before we were established as a center, we worked with them on a variety of issues, including the campaign to ban landmines and now, most recently, cybersecurity. The center has three parts. We have that particular field-oriented research unit. We have what we call the Transformational Media Lab, directed by Beth Carlin, who's here somewhere. And it focuses on the way in which social media, information technology generally, is being used to help people to understand some of these issues, to raise concern about them, to mobilize support for them. And ironically, one of the case studies that we've been doing over the past year and a half has been of the tremendous impact using social media that Invisible Children has had. So when their video went viral 3 weeks ago, and suddenly had 100 million viewers in 6 days, we discovered that we were the people the only people who had actually been carefully studying their impact over the last decade. So it's been a sort of intense period for us as we try and develop some findings and help sort of structure the debate about them. We also have an Earth Studio directed by Pamela Donahue, which looks at the ways in which art is grappling with these issues as they challenge the world, and it's a fascinating sort of addition to what we do. Now, I've known Ron for quite a long time. I think that when I was completing my dissertation, I moved from Princeton to British Columbia, and I spent a couple of years there. I finished my dissertation. I taught a couple of courses. I got a postdoctoral grant, and Ron was one of the students there who was early, I guess, a little bit earlier than me. I think he's more than caught up. He's surpassed me. But at that time, he was a little bit earlier than me in this PhD game. And so I got to know him very well. One of my very first real pieces of academic work was something that Ron and I spent hours and hours discussing. And over the years, it has been utterly fantastic to watch his career develop and the significance of his interest. He is really one of the world, and I say this with complete objectivity, one of the world's most innovative thinkers in trying to understand the implications, the various implications of cyber sort of development for human rights and security. He is currently a professor at the University of Toronto, professor of political science, a graduate, by the way, of the University of British Columbia. He directs the Canada Centre for Global Security Studies, which is part of the Munk School, sort of Canada's equivalent to Harvard's Kennedy School. He's also the director of the Citizen Lab. The Citizen Lab is quite famous, and that is where this investigation into the internet, human rights and security takes place. And you may well be familiar with some of its very influential reports. Ron was the lead author of a couple of very, very important studies of espionage. One of them, Ghost Tracker, looked at the global espionage system, which had infiltrated literally hundreds of computers in something like 103 countries around the world. And Ron was the individual whose team documented and exposed this. They did a second report called Shadows in the Clouds that looked at a similar network of espionage that had taken shape in the cloud. And so these reports are sort of the headline-grabbing reports, featured on the sort of the front page of the New York Times repeatedly. Fascinating and tremendously important work. Ron is also, one of the things that I think is most impressive is the incredible, almost cult-like following he has among students. He's the recipient of numerous teaching awards. I read some of his evaluations when I was in Toronto. They sort of choked you up. But he has a tremendously loyal following of students. He serves on a variety of editorial and advisory boards. He's been a great colleague doing tremendously important work. And it's a real pleasure to welcome him here to the University of California at Irvine for this, our second distinguished speaker lecture. And he's going to be talking about big data meets Big Brother. Please join me in welcoming Ron Deibert.
Well, thanks to the Consul General David Franzen and the Government of Canada for sponsoring this luncheon and making it possible for me to come here, and to Richard Matthew and his team here at UC Irvine for hosting it. I'm really grateful, and I just leaned over to David and said, after that introduction, I just feel like stopping and leaving and retiring. I can't follow that up, Richard. It's unfair. So I'm just going to get right into it and talk about big data meets Big Brother. Gradually and almost imperceptibly, we have immersed ourselves in a global hypermedia environment. And this environment increasingly subsumes and connects everything we do. We work, we play, we organize within it. Our lives have been, in essence, turned inside out and dispersed in endless ethereal clouds that follow us around in extra dimensionality, with a range of untethered devices that give us mobility. Cyberspace, the name now given to the global hypermedia environment, is the fastest growing communications medium in world history, connecting almost 2/3 of humanity together in a common communications space. In short, we now live in a complex, immersive, and highly dynamic communications ecosystem. As with any social change as major as this, we should expect unintended consequences, unforeseen change, and emergent properties, not all of which will be desirable. Past experiences of the printing press, telegraph, radio, and television tell us that new media environments shape and constrain the realm of the possible, favoring some social forces and ideas over others, often in ways that are very difficult to predict and contrary to the original design. This is especially relevant to consider as attention now turns among policymakers to urgently governing and securing this domain we have created. Our elites have grown up to see cyberspace as inevitable, constant, and always there. It is really impossible to imagine going back to a world before cheap and always available 24/7 connectivity, a bustling world of images, text, and sound at our fingertips. We have re-engineered our business, governance, social relations around the existence of a planetary network like none before it. Governments around the world have now banked on the information revolution, recognizing that knowledge is an essential component of development. But policymakers are often caught up in narrow self-interest and seek simple solutions to complex problems that are not easy to understand. Cyberspace is very difficult to govern, in part because it is primarily owned and operated by the private sector, but also in part because its characteristics change so rapidly. As soon as a politician gets their head around a problem long enough to come up with what they think is a solution, the environment may change entirely. The rules of the road written in the wild by the users and operators, leading to new unforeseen problems. And yet there is a palpable urgency to act today. Threats of cyber espionage, warfare, major and growing menaces of cybercrime and data breaches, new forms of anonymized social movements like WikiLeaks and Anonymous have vaulted cybersecurity to the top of the international political agenda. Fear is now driving politics in cyberspace. And as Samuel Coleridge once remarked, what begins in fear usually ends in folly. Now in my presentation, I'm going to lay out some of the issues in cyberspace governance and security connected to these major shifts in communicating that are occurring all around us. And I'll begin with a focus on big data, which has become the predominant way of referring to some of the central characteristics of cyberspace, in particular the massive explosion of information. My thesis is that major social forces reflecting deep and powerful constellations of actors, habits, and interests are coming together in ways that are radically changing this communications environment. Now, it's hard to predict what that environment is going to look like down the road, or even whether the changes have plateaued. We may not have seen the end of any cycle, in other words. But we can say for sure that they will inevitably affect some assumptions many people make about the internet and democracy. Now, while there are many wonderful positive attributes of big data, there are also some unforeseen emergent properties and potentially undesirable consequences, especially for rights, openness, and networking. First, what is big data? Well, there are stock definitions in industry, but I like to think of big data in metaphorical terms as the endless digital grains of sand on an endlessly mutating, ever-expanding beach as we move, think, and act through cyberspace. Big data comes from everywhere, from sensors used to gather climate information, posts made to social media sites, digital pictures and videos posted online, transaction records of online purchases, and from cell phone GPS signals. Every day, 2.5 quintillion bytes of data are created, and it's said that 90% of the data in the world today was created within the past 2 years. Most of this data comes from us, each of us, as we go about our daily lives. Web searches, software downloads, music purchases, tweets, Skype calls. Approximately 250 million tweets are posted every day, and more than 29 billion have been created since Twitter's launch. The volume of data we secrete has been amplified by mobile forms of connectivity. Global mobile data traffic more than doubled in 2011 for the 4th year in a row. It is expected that the number of mobile connected devices will exceed the world's population by the end of this year. At least one mobile phone for every human being on the planet. Searching, texting, linking, networking, sharing, purchasing. The data that is secreted by us carry with them not just the info we intend to send, but data about the data, metadata, that reveals information such as the user's number, the intended receiver, the geolocation of where the message was sent, the date and time of the message, the duration, the amount of data transmitted, and the cost of the transmission, among other things, all available for inspection and repurposing. An average user can have thousands of data points like this collected from them every day as they go about working, social networking, and communicating. That means every call we make, every text and email we send on our mobile phones yields a space-time coordinate down to the level of meters and microseconds that is stored on a server somewhere, or even multiple places, clouds of computers spread out along the physical infrastructure of cyberspace. That information is an embodiment of us, but one that we no longer fully control. Information has gone from scarce to super abundant, as The Economist says. It exists in a new dimensional plane that is growing in all directions. Now, obviously, there are many good things that will come from the big data universe. We can see them already. For example, we can now predict disease outbreaks using tools like Google Flu Trends. It is said that Google's flu prediction analytics is better than the Center for Disease Control. And the way that they do this is by gathering together all of the searches that are made through their search engine. And through that, they can tell that a flu outbreak is going to happen, say in a city like Chicago or Orange County, simply by the number of searches that are done for symptoms like, flu, medicine, runny nose, and so on. By collating all that together, they can accurately predict flu outbreaks. It's phenomenal. The ability to manipulate big data, visualize dynamics, and recognize patterns and signatures for conflict also creates new opportunities for humanitarian and development assistance in the most complex and dangerous environments. This is something I know Richard's very passionate about. We can crowdsource disaster relief and humanitarian operations as was done in Haiti. In this case, researchers use mobile data patterns to understand and predict movements of refugees and consequent health risks. An example from Haiti demonstrates how mobile data analysis could really revolutionize disaster and emergency responses. We can hold governments to account, as has been done in election and conflict monitoring projects undertaken with the crowdsourcing platform Ushahidi. In some ways, this is the approach of my lab, the Citizen Lab, combining technical interrogation of data with in-country field research. But such a rapid transformation of the communications environment like this just can't take place without some unintended consequences. And to understand what some of these might be, we first need to understand the political economy of big data, which really boils down to a simple question. Why is it that we can use Gmail, Facebook, and Twitter services for free? Well, as Adam Smith said, there is no free lunch. The business model of big data rests on the repurposing of that which all of us routinely give away. The heart of the big data market is personal information, which is harvested and repurposed for advertising purposes. Internet service providers, web hosting companies, cloud and mobile providers, massive telecommunications and financial firms, and a host of new digital market organisms digest and process unimaginably large volumes of information about each and every one of us. Social networks may seem like cozy hangouts, as this ad shows, but they are in reality vast data accumulating vacuum cleaners that hoover every click and shared link, every like or status change, every data of personal history, which are then processed and repackaged to advertisers, hoping to leverage that information to target their ads with the right audience. Facebook likes are translated into custom dating and vacation ads. Location data is filtered into intrusive localized advertising. We walk through our lives leaving digital traces like this behind us, like grains of sand on this ever-mutating, constantly expanding beach I talked about. And so not surprisingly, a huge market has exploded to harvest these grains of sand like millions of crabs of all shapes and sizes, systematically picking through our digital droppings, collating them, passing them around and inspecting them, turning them into something marketable and feeding them back to us. Many internet companies stress the protections around customers' content, but actually treat data as business records that they can retain and manipulate indefinitely. They see us and our habits as resources in the way energy companies see untapped reserves of oil. The small print included with many apps is giving developers the right to access users' phone books, text messages, and emails. By agreeing to these little red terms and conditions contained in the fine print of these documents, users, meaning us, we're giving companies the right to inspect personal information and even find out who we're talking to. In many shocking cases involving mobile apps, if you have them on your mobile phone, users are giving apps the right to collect whatever images a camera happens to be seeing, as well as the phone's location. This is Max Schrems, an Austrian law student. He asked Facebook to send him all of the data the company had stored on him. Now, as Max is a European citizen, and Facebook has operations in Europe, Max has a right to make such requests. The results were a little more than astonishing. Facebook sent Max a CD containing 1,222 individual PDFs that they had collected about Max. The company stored information on all of Max's logins, pokes, chat messages, and postings he ever made, even those that he had deleted. It stored on a detailed map the precise geolocational information for all of the pictures that Max posted for his holiday trips. The exact location pinpointed on a map where the picture was taken. In fact, Facebook stores dozens of categories of data about each of its users so that it can more accurately commodify its customers' digital persona for targeted ads. Some examples: the exact latitude, longitude, and altitude of every check-in to Facebook, which itself is given a unique ID number and a timestamp. Every single Facebook event to which a user has been invited, including all invitations that were ignored or rejected. Data on the machines to which you use to connect to Facebook, so that Facebook can connect individuals to the hardware and software that they use. Now, mobile providers who own and operate the infrastructure retain this data, but their retention times can vary. In the United States, Verizon holds on to user information for 12 months, AT&T for 84 months, go figure, Sprint for 24, and T-Mobile for 4 to 6 months. Now, these companies have proven to be callous and sometimes outright brazen in their desire to access our data. Path, a popular social network, was recently caught uploading members' mobile phone contacts to its servers without permission. Okay? Likewise, Twitter recently admitted that it copied lists of email addresses and phone numbers from those who used its smartphone application and stored them on its servers, again without asking users permission. Without user consent, Facebook announced in December last year that it would post archived user information, making old posts available under new downgraded privacy settings. Users were given 1 week to clean up their history before this new feature timeline went live. Deleted and archived photos brought back to life without user consent. Now, this surprising announcement was so brazen in light of the fact that it came only a few short weeks after a decision was made by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, which found that the company had engaged in, quote, unfair and deceptive trade practices when it changed the privacy settings of its users. Here's another case. In 2010, Google came under fire when its camera-equipped cars were discovered to also have been gathering huge amounts of data from people's private Wi-Fi networks, including passwords, personal emails, and web browsing histories. Google has said it didn't realize it had been gathering that data and said it would erase the information. But the company has also strongly resisted proposed European Commission regulations called the right to be forgotten, which would require them to provide an option to users to delete the data that they store about them, including metadata. More recently, it apologized again when it was found to be secretly circumventing the privacy protections on Safari's web browser, and a Stanford University researcher made the discovery, for which Google again apologized. It said, oops. Now, it's easy to demonize the companies who are driving the business models and innovation around the trend to big data, but part of the shift is also related to our own habits. We have, all of us here in this room, created this hypermedia environment with constant innovation, extensive social sharing of data, and mobile networking from multiple platforms and locations. We've immersed ourselves and entrusted our information to clouds and social networking services operated by thousands of companies of all shapes, sizes, and geographic locations. We are socialized to share through clicking, attachments, hyperlinks. We click on website addresses and documents like mice clicking on pellet dispensers. We have turned our digital lives inside out in an electronic web of our own spinning, but have yet to personally, fully experience what it really means for ourselves, our lives, and our personal relations. Here is my dog. This is my place of work. This is what I eat for lunch. These are my friends. This is my phone number. Surveillance systems penetrate every aspect of life as people implicitly consent to the greatest invasion of personal privacy in history, individuals can be mapped in space and time with a degree of sophistication that would make the greatest tyrants of days past envious, almost entirely as a result of our own digital habits. Social networking has given us the age of auto-surveillance. Now, John Villa-Senior, who's a computer engineer in this part of the world at UCLA, puts it very well. Most of us do not remember what we read online or wrote on April 29th, 2011, or what clothes we wore that day. We don't remember the phone calls we made, or how long we talked, or whether we went to the grocery store, and if so, what we purchased there. But all that information is archived, and if a pressing enough need were to arise, our activities on that day could be reconstructed in nearly complete detail by third parties, all with our consent. Just because something happened in the distant past does not mean that it is forgotten. There is no statute of limitations on our digital lives. So two big forces are coming together. The big market for big data, supplied by our big desire to socialize and network. Let's turn now to another big force, the state. To begin, we need to dispel a myth right off the bat about the relationship between territoriality, the state, and cyberspace. The physical geography of cyberspace matters. Most of us use the internet without thinking much beyond the computer screen in front of us. We approach cyberspace in the way that William Gibson defined it: clean chrome, virtual endless city lights receding, a consensual hallucination. It is important to understand, though, that while our internet experiences may seem ephemeral and some kind of virtual mirage, the infrastructure in which it is embedded involves a complex material, logistical, and regulatory infrastructure that can span multiple jurisdictions, from the local to the national to the international. While the text, the image, and the video all may still seem within our immediate grasps, on our desktops and handheld devices, they are not. Data that we handle, that we assume is in our possession, are in fact transported to us in an instant over cables and through radio waves from arrays of servers, many of which are far from us in another political jurisdiction than the one in which we live. And those different political jurisdictions matter a lot. Take cloud computing. Cloud computing has untethered PCs and networks by virtualizing infrastructures. Data that used to be stored on our desktops and in our filing cabinets have evaporated into the clouds. Now, this shift has eased access to planetary computing facilities for individuals, companies, universities, and governments. But where exactly are the clouds? Exploring that question raises significant jurisdictional and privacy issues. For example, very few citizens outside of the United States realize that their data stored on Google servers, even those physically residing in their own country, are subject to US Patriot Act provisions because Google is domiciled in the United States and the Act compels Google to turn over its data when required, no matter where that data is stored. For that reason, many European companies are now debating laws that will ban public officials from using Google or other cloud computing services for fear that their citizens' personal data will be at risk. In other words, the big data world we have created and rely on is an overlay of the existing sovereign state system. Emails, searches, documents, and chats can transverse multiple political jurisdictions at the speed of light, which of course raises fundamental questions about state power in cyberspace. Now, this is a project undertaken by some colleagues of mine at the University of Toronto called IX Maps, and their aim is to use trace routing techniques to map the paths that packets take as they route through the internet, highlighting known internet exchange points, which are the physical locations where major internet service providers and telcos peer their information. IXPs came to public attention a few years back during the Bush administration when a whistleblower working at AT&T revealed the existence of a secret NSA eavesdropping facility at 2 of these locations, monitoring all traffic, including American traffic, and that's an entirely separate conversation all on its own. As you can see from their experiment, email that starts at the University of Toronto, and in this case is destined for the Hockey Hall of Fame, which is just down the street, can actually route through Chicago, right? And possibly into one of the known NSA monitoring facilities in the city, okay? Which brings up a very important point. The emergence of the big data universe is happening simultaneously with a sea change in the way that governments are asserting themselves in cyberspace right now. Whereas once the dominant metaphor of internet regulation was hands-off, laissez-faire, today the dominant metaphor is one of intervention, control, assertion of state power, and increasingly geopolitical contestation over the domain of cyberspace itself. Governments have begun to seek the capacity to fight and win wars in cyberspace. Autocratic and repressive regimes, once thought to be dinosaurs of the information age, are manipulating flows of information to disable opposition, identify meddlesome activists, and create a climate of fear and self-censorship. There are major concerns over critical infrastructure and other threats that are driving surveillance and even the re-engineering of the internet. Now, each of these dynamics are interrelated and reinforcing, not only with each other, but with the world of big data. Consider the massive underbelly of cybercrime, which is intimately connected to the world of big data and is a major impetus behind calls for greater government regulation and control right now. Now, cybercrime has formed a hidden shadow and a kind of evil doppelganger to every step of the internet's history from its early origins. But its growth has suddenly become explosive in recent years by virtually any estimate. According to some security companies, there are around 80,000 new malicious software samples received every day. Every 1.4 seconds of every day, a new malware sample arrives. Botnets, huge networks of compromised computers under an attacker's control that can be used to engage in denial of service attacks against any target, can be rented from public forums and websites for as little as $100. Some even offer 24/7 technical support. The underground economy of cybercrime shadows and exploits each new innovation, always at the cutting edge. Now, for example, security analysts are seeing a huge explosion in malicious software targeting, guess what, mobile applications and mobile phone uses. With the proliferation of end-user application developments comes ingenious end-user criminal applications that subvert and misuse the platform, such as this Trojan, which masquerades as a battery performance indicator, looks legitimate, but once installed, connects back silently to the attackers who control every aspect of the mobile phone's internal networking. Malware targeting Android phones in particular have skyrocketed in recent years because Google's Android platform is open to wider development and does not have the same checks and balances as do, say, iPhone apps. Security vendors are calling 2011 the year of the mobile malware. But mobile is only one vector of a major and growing network of distributed vulnerabilities that have been created by the consolidation of data into third-party servers lacking security. When combined with the massive proliferation of widespread and easy-to-use tools of cybercrime, a dangerous brew has been created. Not surprisingly, we have seen a growing number of major security breaches across governments and the private sector. According to Privacy Rights Clearinghouse, nearly 600 million records have been breached due to the roughly 2,670 data breaches made public since 2005 in the United States alone. Included among these was the breach of Epsilon systems, resulting in a loss of more than 60 million email addresses from more than 50 companies. A breach of Sony servers in April 2011 resulted in the exposure of more than 100 million people's private data. Major US defense contractors have also now admitted to persistent breaches and attacks. Perhaps the most recent and visible that you may know about is Anonymous's breach of geopolitical commercial security company Stratfor, resulting in the release of 5 million confidential emails to WikiLeaks. We should expect more of this as data migrates to insecure computing platforms. The tools to engage in this type of exploitation popularize, and the vectors of exploitation multiply almost exponentially. Now, although many of these breaches appear to be mostly opportunistic hacks by anti-authoritarian groups intending to wreak general havoc against the system, there have been a growing number of them that have clearly sophisticated political and economic motivations. Our own research that Richard mentioned off the top has uncovered cyber espionage networks emanating from Chinese, Iranian, Syrian, Burmese, and other national jurisdictions, targeting numerous high-profile government, military, political opposition, human rights targets across Asia, Europe, North America. Our GhostNet investigation began with alleged penetrations into the computer systems of the Dalai Lama's office and the Tibetan government in exile, and we were led eventually to the discovery of a network of compromised computers across 103 countries, focused mostly on ministries of foreign affairs, embassies, and other political targets. The victim list includes everything from the Russian embassy in Beijing, the foreign ministry of Iran, the Laotian prime minister's office, Indian embassies around the world. It was truly stunning. The second investigation, which we called Shadows in the Cloud, released a year later, was related to the GhostNet investigation, that the initial infection was found on the same computers at the Dalai Lama's office that we investigated during GhostNet, but in the Shadows case, it was much more focused on companies in the Indian foreign and defense ministries. Now, one overarching characteristic we have found in our research is that the tradecraft that was employed by the perpetrators is indistinguishable from that used in the ecosystem of cybercrime. As cyberspace becomes an object of geopolitical contests in a political battlefield among authoritarian regimes and their adversaries, we should expect the clouds to become vectors for cyber espionage and politically motivated attacks. The growth of cybercrime is thus much more than a persistent nuisance. It has become a highly ranked risk factor for governments, businesses, and individuals alike. And the consequences for this exploding threat vector are going to be numerous and wide-ranging, leading, among other things, for pressures for greater state regulation, intervention, and even exploitation. Consider the so-called Stuxnet attack, which leveraged several zero-day vulnerabilities and crossed an air-gapped system, a system that wasn't even connected to the internet, to degrade and essentially sabotage nuclear enrichment facilities in Iran. A major concern is the vulnerability of critical infrastructures, energy systems like nuclear power plants and electricity grids. Many of these systems are increasingly connected to the internet in order to save costs and allow remote access. Although the vulnerabilities of affecting these systems are quite complex, the Stuxnet attack showed it is not impossible. We should expect more like that. In fact, cyberspace has all of the characteristics of a spiraling security dilemma situation. Offense is dominant. Barriers to entry are low. Deterrence is difficult to normalize because attribution is so tricky. There are enormous pressures to react quickly. And so, not surprisingly, as scholars of international security would predict in these circumstances, an arms race has unfolded, with governments urgently standing up military capabilities. There is an arms race in cyberspace right now. Perhaps unsurprisingly, also, a massive cyber industrial complex has bloomed to service and profit from this arms race. To defend their networks and data against a growing proliferation of threats, companies are seeking security solutions. To maneuver in the hypermedia environment, states require increasingly specialized products and services, which in turn has opened up an enormous market opportunity tapping into lucrative defense budgets. Cold War giants like Boeing and Northrop Grumman, others, are turning to cybersecurity, as are a bewildering and seemingly endless array of niche companies. This market is estimated to be anywhere between 80 and 150 billion annually worldwide. Their wares are peddled at obscure international trade shows, typically restricted to law enforcement, intelligence, and the military. Computer network exploitation, deep packet inspection, social network mapping, cell phone tracking, geolocational tracking, all manifestations of a new muscular exercise of state power in cyberspace. These products and services, this market, is not just reactive. As policymakers are given the products and services to do things that they never before even imagined, an epistemic shift occurs around the framework for rights and governance. What was inconceivable is increasingly now considered routine. Lawmakers now justify radical changes to basic checks and balances on state surveillance as a part of a supposed necessity of the digital age. They are also requiring the private sector to do more to police the internet. And in order to do that, they need to enlist the companies who own and operate the infrastructure and are the frontline sensors of this big data universe. The privacy researcher Chris Segoyan has studied how these new laws affect corporate behavior and how some companies actually derive revenues from compliance with these laws, charging fees for lawful access. He notes that the volume of requests received by one wireless carrier, Sprint, here in the United States, grew so large that the 110-member electronic surveillance team couldn't keep up. So what they did is they automated the process by developing a web interface that gives law enforcement agents direct access to users' data for a fee. That website was used by law enforcement agents over 8 million times in a single year. That's in the United States. What's going on in other parts of the world? As I said, not too long ago, internet pundits mocked slow-footed authoritarian regimes and predicted their demise. But they have shown a resilience that belies the conventional wisdom. Our research has tracked the evolution of cyberspace controls for the last 10 years. It started out with crude and defensive blocks on internet surfing in the early days to new, more sophisticated approaches, subjecting the internet to tighter regulations, downloading controls to the private sector, providing tacit support for national armies like the Iranian and Syrian cyber armies, and targeted surveillance. Today, these regimes are also the prime customers for the tradecraft of cyberspace controls and are getting more savvy about how to manipulate the space, including the private companies that operate it, to their advantage. Take the so-called Green Revolution in Iran and its aftermath. In 2009, you may remember a social movement mobilized on the streets of Iranian cities, connecting through networks of support to individuals in Europe and North America. It was dubbed a Twitter revolution by many. The demonstrations achieved wider support for their cause and were able to organizing using all of these social networking, mobile, and other internet technologies. But the Iranian authorities took countermeasures aimed at controlling the spaces online for resistance and dissent, and not just by censoring access to websites. They employed more offensive actions. The internet was slowed down in many cities, and there were periods where it was not accessible at all. It essentially ground to a halt. SMS messaging and mobile phone connections were suspended or jammed. Through evidence that has subsequently emerged, we now know that Iranian authorities were able to get the cooperation of Nokia Siemens, the largest cell phone carrier in the country, who turned over data to the Revolutionary Guard. Cyber organizers found themselves being targeted and arrested. Now, the complicity of Western companies in authoritarian regimes is not new, not even in this area. Over the years, we have uncovered that many of the countries who censor the internet rely on products and services developed by Western manufacturers. Citizen Lab contributed to reports that unearthed the use of Smart Filter in Iran in 2005, Fortinet in Burma in 2006, WebSense in Yemen, Tunisia, and the United Arab Emirates in 2008 and 2009, all companies headquartered in Silicon Valley. In part because of the awareness raised by our reports, One of these companies, WebSense, has just recently issued a directive whereby they will no longer sell such products and services to regimes that violate human rights. Another recent report of ours identified that devices manufactured by Blue Coat, a US company, were being used in Burma and Syria, not only to censor, but to isolate and identify particular types of communication traffic associated with pro-democracy activists in the context of what many consider to be crimes against humanity occurring in that country. Blue Coat first denied the findings, then conceded the evidence that they could no longer deny, which has brought about calls for a US congressional investigation by some lawmakers. We have also published several reports that detail how a Canadian company, NetSweeper, right now sells products and services to ISPs in Yemen, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. In fact, NetSweeper stepped in when WebSense backed out of those markets. This is a Guelph-based company in Canada that blocks access to human rights information, news, gay and lesbian information, and information critical of the regime. Sadly, our reports have not led to the same type of outrage among Canadian parliamentarians or officials as has happened in US Congress about Blue Coat. But our research has only picked at the surface of a major field. Products that provide advanced deep packet inspection, content filtering, social network mining, cell phone tracking, and even computer attack capabilities are being developed right now by US, Canadian, and European firms and marketed worldwide to regimes seeking to limit democratic participation. And that market really knows no boundaries. We are already seeing Chinese, Indian, and Brazilian firms stepping into the same marketplace. To summarize, I see several major technological and social forces converging in ways that are hard to predict their outcomes. Huge volumes of data driven by commercial innovation and a massively expanding new market opportunity. A private desire for fame, convenience, consumerization, and fun. The securitization of a domain that previously was largely obscure or overlooked by states, including most importantly authoritarian regimes, and a massive and growing cybersecurity industrial complex. It's hard to say what exactly the impact of this will be, but for openness, rights, and networking worldwide, it does not look promising. And that is how big data meets Big Brother. Thank you very much.